Hello everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. Hope you're well today. This is a Saturday, so it's the time of the week when there might be a video out, and it turns out that today is one of those days. I'm very much intending to release a video tomorrow, but got the inspiration because there's still more to say about the Enneagram in relation to INFJs, perhaps in relation to other types as well. There's interest expressed in the comments, and I think that we're covering good ground. So let's continue. Today I'm going to focus on a comparison of type 4, type 5, type 6. So like the three in comparison, with perhaps a little bit of a focus on the one in the middle, the type 5. But we'll see how it goes. I have a broad sketch in my mind. Let's see how it goes. But I think I have some interesting insights to share with you, and I can't wait to do that. But first of all, remember that you can get my books. They're available in the description box at all the Amazon links, both less than $10. The authoritative book on the INFJ and my new novel, The Infinite Castle. Please consider supporting me. It's a great book, and it has an INFJ in it, so I won't say any more. Okay, so there is a particular notion that I think has been quite useful to us so far, especially to kind of get a better grasp of what a type 6 is. I'll always be implying when I say a type 6, an INFJ 6, but it is open to discussion whether, again, it applies to more types. But here I'm speaking specifically of my experience of INFJ 6s and INFJ 5s and INFJ 4s. Anyway, the notion in question is the notion of incompleteness. The idea that type 6 feels in some fundamental sense incomplete, and that this is partly what explains the fact that as opposed to the 4 that seeks the best expression of who they are, the 6 seeks who they are. All right, never mind the expression. Who am I? Okay, and they seek that because of this sense of incompleteness. Now, INFJ 4 don't experience that sense of incompleteness. Neither does the INFJ 5 experience that sense of incompleteness. However, what I would like to actually put forward, open for discussion, propose to you, is that incompleteness, in fact, still characterizes something about the type 4 and something about the type 5 as well as the type 6. The difference is in the type or kind of incompleteness that we're talking about. I think in the case of the type 4, the kind of incompleteness is going to naturally follow from what we've been talking about in previous videos. So remember, in the case of the type 6, the incompleteness is at the very center of the notion of the self. Okay, so you could call it a sense of ontological incompleteness. Your very being is incomplete. The case of the 4 doesn't experience ontological incompleteness. There's no problem in that regard. However, clearly they feel some sort of expressive incompleteness. So you could call it a performative incompleteness, an expressive incompleteness, an articulatory incompleteness. I think maybe expressive incompleteness is the best way to put it. They feel complete in terms of their sense of self. They don't feel complete in terms of what's available to them to express it. What's interesting to observe is that if you think about the supposed vice of the type 4, which is envy, it kind of makes sense that in order to be envious of others, you must have a pretty good understanding of what you got going for you. You got a complete understanding, so complete that you can see what you think is lacking, that you could have had, but is, the qualities that are lacking. I'm not saying that your being is lacking. Your being is not incomplete, but of course your being as a complete product has certain qualities and maybe not others. And on the basis of that, you can feel envy. The envy might very well be irrational, but that's the source. If, like a 6, you're perpetually running after your identity, well, envy of others is not going to be your primary concern. I mean, yes, in some sense, you might feel envious that others seem more complete, but that's a very abstract way of approaching the notion of envy. Envy is going to be much more concrete in usual cases, and the condition is that you've got a good grip on who you are, right? The 5 is different. The 5 sin is not envy. The 5 sin is avarice or greed. There's many ways of putting it, which I think confuses people sometimes. Confuses people because we tend to think of greed and avarice as a predisposition to possess things, to be stingy and tight about things with other people. And it becomes very hard on the basis of that sort of ordinary basic notion of greed and avarice to make sense of why it applies to a type 5. Of course, the greed and the avarice relate to something more specific than that. It's not just your everyday type of meanness, No. In order to understand, again, why we talk about greed or avarice in the case of the 5, we have to look at the type 5's kind of incompleteness, right? And it's a kind of in-between. It's not a mix of the 4 incompleteness and the 6 incompleteness, but it's sort of a stage that's in between. And for this reason, I think it's very much not a coincidence that, 5 is between 4 and 6. The placement is important. There is something that the 4 and the 5 have in common, even though one is a heart type and one is a head type. And that is, again, a completeness of being, right? So the 6 doesn't have that. But the 4 and the 5, they have that. They're not going to doubt their existence constantly, okay? They're not going to doubt their identity constantly. They know that there is an identity there and that it's complete, all right? But there's a difference between the 4 and the 5, however. The 4 doesn't just know that there is a complete thing there, which is their identity. They don't just know it's there, they know it full stop. Okay? So the problem for them, and where the incompleteness problem appears, is in the expression of it. In the case of the 5, they know that it's there. The 6 doesn't. They're skeptical of it. The 5 is not. However, the 5 don't know it. And it's a subtle distinction, but it's fundamental, I think, to understanding how Enneagram appreciates these nuances and differences between types. You can have no doubt that something is there and is complete without knowing it. All right? So take the example of, say, the moon, right? The moon. Most of you, I dare hope, don't doubt for a second that there is the moon and it's a complete thing, okay? You just take it for granted. Now, if you think the moon is identity, you have to imagine that the 6 doesn't even manage to convince himself or herself or theirself that it's really there. In the case of the 5, it's like, well, sure, I know that there is such a thing as the moon, but do I know exactly what it's like? Do I know all the materials, all the chemical compounds? Do I know its exact size? Do I know its circumference? What is the atmosphere? What is the pressure on the moon? What is all that? There's a lot of things that I don't know. In fact, most of it I don't know. I just know it's a complete thing. So you have to imagine that if the moon is identity, the 4 both knows that it's there and they know it. They have an intimate knowledge of it. The 5 does not. The 5 knows it's there, so it doesn't have the ontological problems and doubts of the 6. Don't feel the ontological incompleteness, but they have a problem with knowing it in detail. They have a problem with knowing their identity as a whole. Their concern is not with the whole of their being, it's with the whole of their knowledge of their being. So if you describe the incompleteness of the 4 as expressive incompleteness, and the problem of the 6 is ontological incompleteness of being, you can define the problem of the 5 as epistemological incompleteness of knowledge. So incompleteness as expression, 4, or performance. Incompleteness of knowledge, 5. Incompleteness of being, 6. And again, if you think about it this way, you can start making sense of why the sin or the vice of the 5 is greed or avarice. Because typically a 5 will be greedy and avaricious, if you want to call it that, about what they know. Particularly, they accumulate a lot of things, and they keep accumulating as much as they can, and the 5 tends to hate getting rid of knowledge. And even if they cannot have everything in their mind, because their memory is finite and they have a limited storage capacity in their mind, they will collect articles, they will tend to save a lot of information in external objects that may at any point provide their minds with the information they need. So they're greedy about information, they're greedy about knowledge. They're constantly accumulating knowledge because they have this sense of incompleteness. So of course they're going to accumulate it and be defensive of it and be protective of it, withhold it, as it's sometimes called, because it's very precious to them, because they're engaged in this perpetual quest for epistemological completeness. But because epistemological incompleteness defines their essence, they're never going to attain it, so they can continue accumulating, just like the 4 is going to continue perpetually looking for best ways to express their being in their life without ever quite getting there. It can lead to amazing art, by the way, and amazing other things, but the 4 is never going to get to the stage we're going to say, okay, I expressed it perfectly there, I can just stop. No, it's perpetual striving. Knowledge is a perpetual striving for the 5, and security of being is going to be a perpetual problem for the 6. Notice something about the 6. One thing that will immediately strike us is that, well, there are 6s that don't seem to be particularly intellectual, and they're never going to formalize their problem as a problem of ontological incompleteness. There's a reason for that. Now, the reason for that is that because the problem of the 6 is security of being, which is tied to an incompleteness, things in the external world, which can be threats, by the way, are very, very much endowed with a lot of power. I explained that in previous videos on the 6. But they're also always going to be just a means to an end. In the case of the 6, knowledge can be very good. That's why a 6 can often come across as a 5, very intellectual, very cerebral, and has a lot of knowledge. But there's a difference. The 6 doesn't see knowledge as an end in itself because they don't have the problem of epistemological incompleteness. So they see it as a means to an end. In fact, they see it as an epistemic means to an ontological end. Since it is only a means to an end, there's a few consequences that follow. One consequence that follows is that for the 6, knowledge for its own sake is not that important, so knowledge can be discarded. 6s don't have a problem with greediness in that regard. They don't have a problem with avarice in that regard. They can have a lot of information lying around. If they decide that it's no longer useful to them, get rid of it. No problem in that. They don't accumulate stuff like that, okay? A 6 doesn't do that. A 5 does that. Now, the other consequence is that just as knowledge can be a means of securing or feeling like you're getting closer to securing a stable, complete sense of self, knowledge, you can read lots of books about the topic and you're hoping you get there. Well, knowledge is a means, so there can be other means. And if a 6 is someone who doesn't have a kind of particularly intellectual predisposition, maybe they're much more practical, they'll find other means. Knowledge is not just abstract knowledge. Knowledge can be concrete, practical knowledge. And some things that are very concrete and practical and useful to securing a sense of your being are not even technically knowledge. A solid bank account, a good house, a good family, feeling like you belong to a solid community, those things can really help with the sixth sense of incomplete being. They are, in some sense, external means, okay? Whereas the more intellectual six might look for more internal means of getting to a sense of complete being through more knowledge of what is being, what is essence, what is identity. They'll research it, but it's just a means. And for other sixes, the means might be much more practical. I personally think that this is kind of a good summary of my view on the topics. Please let me know if you find that useful in the comments, because, I think that, what I had set out to do in my mind, I did. So I'm really curious about your feedback and continuing the conversation. Enjoy your Saturday, guys. Bye-bye.